The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on the good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do. I hereon to append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with an exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was his design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and that he had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up. He gave me a good day. I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of the Angels Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I'd feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner, blockaded me there with his chair, and he sat down and reeled off a monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about the story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius and finesse. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. Reverend Lee. Well, there was this fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recall exactly, though. That makes me think it was one or the other because I remember the big flume weren't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was a curious man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he got a bet, he was satisfied, but still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most almost come out the winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned that, but that feller had offered to bet on it. Take any side you please, as I was just saying, telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. There's a dog fight, he'd bet on it. There's a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there's a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he'd bet which one would fly away first. If there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And he was, too, and a good man. If he ever even seen a straddle bug start to goes anywhere, he'd bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going to. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddle bug to Mexico. But what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of boys here has seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He bet on anything. Dang this fella. Parson Walker's laid very sick once for a good while. It seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning came in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerably better. Thank the Lord for his infinite mercy. And coming on so smart with the blessing of Providence, she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I risked 2.5 she'd own anyway. And this year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her 15-minute nag. But it was only in fun, because of course she was faster than that. He used to win money on that horse, for she was slow and always had asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something. of that kind, and they used to give her 200 or 300 yard start and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out on one side amongst the fences and kicking up more dust and raising up more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and she always fetched up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a little bull pup that looked like him he weren't worth a cent, but to sit around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like furnaces. And a dog might tackle him, and might bullyrag him and bite him, throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on that he was satisfied, and he hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets began doubling and doubling on the other side all the time till the money was all up. Then all of a sudden, he would just grab the other dog just by the hint of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out the winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once it didn't have no hind legs because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up, he came to make a snatch for his pet Holt, and see in a minute how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he appeared surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged, like he didn't want to try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look as to say his heart was broke, and that it was his fault for putting him up against a dog that had no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in the fight. And then he limped off a piece, and he laid down and he died. It was a good pup, this was that Andrew Jackson, and he would have made a name for himself if he had lived, for the stuff was in him. He had genius. I know it because he had no opportunities to speak of. It don't stand to no reason that a dog can make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all kinds of things till you couldn't rest and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on that he couldn't match you. He catch a frog one day and he took him home and said he calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. Gave him a little punch in the behind, and the next minute you see the frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somersault or maybe a couple. If he got a good start, and he'd come down flat-footed, all right, like a cat. And he got him up so in the matter of catching flies and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail fly every time for as far as he could see him. Smiley said all Frog wanted was education. He could do almost anything, and I believe him. Why, I seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up, snake a fly off the counter there, and flop down on the floor again as solid as a goblin bud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he had been doing any more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for he was all so gifted. And when it came to fair and square jumping on dead level, he could get more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on dead level was his strong suit, you understand. And when it came to that, Smiley would ante up the money on him as long as he had bread. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog. And well he might be, for fellas had traveled and been everywheres. They all laid over. They said he laid over any frog they'd ever seen. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. And one day a fella, a stranger in the camp he was, came across him with his box and says, "What might be you got in the box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "Well, might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the fellow took it and looked at it carefully, turned it round this way and that, and says, so 'tis. Well, what's he good for? Well, Smiley says, easy and careless, he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He could outjump any frog in Calaveras County. The fellow took the box again and took another long, particular look and gave it back to Smiley and says, very deliberate, well, says, I don't see no points about him that's any better than any other frog. Maybe you don't, Smiley says, and maybe you understand frogs and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you had experience and maybe you only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 he could outjump any frog in Calaveras County. The fellow studied a minute, and then he says, kinder sad like, well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you. Then Smiley says, that's all right, that's all right. If you hold my box a minute, I'll go get you a frog. So the fellow took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. And he sat there a good while thinking and thinking to himself. And then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. Filled him pretty much near to his chin and set him on the floor. Smiley went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time. And finally he catched the frog and fetched him in and gave him to this fellow and says, now, if you ready, you get him alongside Daniel with his forepaws even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word. And he says, 1, 2, 3, get! And him and the fellow touched up the frogs from the behind, and the new frog hopped up lively. But Daniel gave a little heave, hustled up his shoulders so, like a Frenchman, but it weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church. He couldn't no more stir if he had been anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The fellow took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder so at Daniel. It says again, very deliberate. Well, he says, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog. Smiley stood scratching his head, looking down at Daniel a long time. At last he says, I do wonder what nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look a bit baggy somehow. He catch up Daniel by the nape of the neck and hefted him up and says, well, blam my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds. Turned him upside down and he belched out a handful of shot. And then he seen how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and he took after that fella, but he never did catch him, and here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and he got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me, he said, as he moved away, he said, just sit where you are, stranger. Rest easy. I ain't gonna be gone a second. But by your leave, I did not think that the continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. Well, this here Smiley had a yellow, one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just sort of stumped like a banana nanner. And, however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, and I took my leave.